In the 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul says something else again. He's talking about how this is not necessarily the life he would have chosen, going around being beaten, being shipwrecked, stoned, thrown out of cities, and so on. But he says, necessity is laid upon me. Woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. He talks about being driven by Christ to preach the gospel. And we see this in his own conversion story. He's knocked off his horse by a bright light on the road to Damascus, and Jesus says to Paul, basically, get up, from now on, you're my slave, you're my servant, I am your despotes, your master. Who do you think you are, Paul, kicking against the goads? And Paul, converted to Christ, gets up and obeys his master. This is not a weak, wimpy Jesus knocking on the door of Paul's heart, asking to be let in. This is Jesus blowing down the castle walls of Paul's heart and saying, you're mine, and you have no choice. And Paul says, yes, sir. So in the 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul says, necessity is laid upon me. Woe is me if I don't preach the gospel. And that is an exact echo in the Greek of the Greek behind all the translations of the Apology. Paul is echoing clearly what Socrates says. Socrates says, necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I don't do what Apollo says. So Paul is clearly alluding to a work of literature that everyone would have known about in the Corinthian church in order to make his point. I think that that's a fairly profound idea that's well worth thinking about, both in part for the sake of our use of pagan literature. When people say, why should we use pagan literature? One answer would be simply to point to the Apostle Paul as our model, because he did. But also might be to press that answer a little bit further and say, and secondly, because clearly Paul recognizes, as we ought to recognize, that there are some true and perceptive and wise things said in pagan literature, even though they were pagans and didn't give glory to the true God. Socrates is perceptive. Plato, as he writes Socrates' conversation, is very perceptive about these things. He says there's a higher wisdom that most people don't acknowledge. Pride and arrogance stand in our way, but if we recognize that there's a greater wisdom, with the humility of knowing that we don't know everything and so on, then we're on the way to a better condition. Now, of course, Socrates, Plato, these pagan philosophers don't have the full answer. They don't recognize where this truth comes from. They don't follow it out as far as it should be followed out. But clearly they're saying something right, and that's what the Apostle Paul picks up on.